The laundry delivery truck made its usual rounds to Dublin's finest hotels. Fresh linens, perfectly pressed, competitively priced. No one asked who washed them. The women behind those walls had been scrubbing sheets for decades, but their names appeared nowhere on the invoices. Were they employees or something else entirely? Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. The first Magdalene laundry opened in Dublin in 1821, but by the 1850s, these institutions had spread throughout Ireland and parts of Britain like a network of fortified convents designed for a singular purpose. The religious orders called them asylums for fallen women, homes for moral reform, refuges for the vulnerable. The women inside learned different names for these places, though they rarely spoke them aloud. Behind walls topped with broken glass and iron gates locked from the outside, the Catholic Church had constructed a system that would operate for nearly 175 years, processing thousands of women through facilities that existed somewhere between charity house, workhouse, and prison. The Sisters of Mercy, the Good Shepherd Sisters, and several other religious orders established these institutions across Ireland's major cities and rural towns throughout the mid-19th century. Each laundry followed a similar architectural pattern. High stone walls surrounded large compounds containing dormitories, industrial laundry facilities, chapels, and courtyards where women could take brief exercise under supervision. The buildings themselves projected an image of religious sanctuary, with crosses mounted prominently and stained glass windows facing the streets. What passers-by could not see were the locked doors, the barred windows on upper floors, and the complete absence of any mechanism by which women inside could leave of their own volition. The admission process revealed the institution's true nature. Women arrived through multiple channels, each path leading to the same destination. Families brought daughters pregnant outside marriage, desperate to hide the shame before neighbors noticed. Priests referred women they deemed too forward, too questioning, too resistant to their authority. Courts sentenced women convicted of minor offenses, like petty theft or prostitution, judges viewing the laundries as more appropriate than jails for female offenders. Social workers directed unmarried mothers to these facilities, presenting them as the only option for women without family support. In some cases, women committed no offense beyond being considered too attractive, too independent, or too mentally fragile to remain in regular society. Not entry. The transformation began immediately. Women surrendered their personal clothing, receiving identical institutional uniforms. They handed over any money, letters, photographs, or possessions, which vanished into the nuns' keeping, rarely to be returned. Their hair was cut short, both for hygiene in the laundry work and as the first step in erasing individual identity. Most significantly, they lost their names. The religious orders assigned each woman a number, occasionally a saint's name different from her own, systematically severing her connection to her former life. The justification presented to families, courts, and the public emphasized religious redemption and practical training. The nuns claimed they were saving fallen women from lives of sin, providing them with honest work that would reform their characters and prepare them for respectable employment. The language of rescue and salvation disguised what the institutions actually provided: indefinite detention with no defined sentence, no legal representation, no right to appeal, and no oversight from civil authorities. Women had no way to know when they might be released. Some were told they must remain until they had saved enough money through their labor to pay for their keep, an impossible calculation since they received no wages. Others were simply told to pray and work until the sisters deemed them sufficiently reformed. By the 1850s, this system had become deeply embedded in Irish society. Families relied on the laundries as solutions to pregnancies that would bring social ruin. Churches presented them as acts of mercy rather than institutions of control. The government tacitly approved through its complete failure to regulate or inspect these facilities. And the women inside found themselves trapped in a parallel world, where time moved differently, where years could pass without contact with family or the outside world, where their labor generated profits for religious orders, while they themselves owned nothing, not even their own names. The architecture of shame had been built, and it would stand for over a century. The moment a woman crossed the threshold into a Magdalene laundry, her former identity ceased to exist in any official capacity. The institutional machinery operated with precision, designed to erase individuality and enforce absolute control. Within the first hours of arrival, new inmates underwent a transformation process that religious orders described as spiritual cleansing, but functioned as systematic dehumanization. Personal clothing went into storage, theoretically to be returned upon departure, though many women would never see these belongings again. The institutions issued identical gray or brown dresses, coarse undergarments, and heavy aprons designed to withstand the caustic chemicals and scalding water of laundry work. Hair cutting followed, with nuns claiming hygiene concerns, but the practical effect stripped away one of the most visible markers of personal identity. The naming system completed this erasure. Some facilities assigned numbers, referring to women as Penitent 14 or Magdalene 27. Others imposed new names, often selecting martyred saints or biblical figures meant to inspire moral reflection. A woman named Catherine might become Mary Magdalene for the duration of her stay, her actual identity acknowledged only in the private records the nuns maintained. This renaming served multiple purposes. It made administrative tracking easier, prevented women from forming connections based on their outside lives, and symbolically marked them as different people undergoing religious transformation. The daily routine began before dawn and followed an unvarying schedule. Women rose at 5:30 for morning prayers in the chapel, followed by a meager breakfast of bread, porridge, and weak tea. By 7 o'clock, they entered the laundry facilities that gave these institutions their names and their economic foundation. The work areas contained large industrial washing equipment, drying rooms filled with steam, ironing stations with heavy heated irons, and folding tables where finished items were sorted and packaged for delivery to paying customers. The commercial laundry work generated substantial income for the religious orders. Hotels, hospitals, wealthy households, and institutions sent their linens, clothing, and table goods to the Magdalene laundries, attracted by prices lower than commercial laundries because the facilities paid no wages. Women worked 12 to 16-hour shifts depending on the volume of orders, handling massive loads of soiled linens, scrubbing stains with harsh soaps and chemicals, operating dangerous machinery without safety equipment, and standing for hours in rooms where temperatures exceeded comfortable levels due to boiling water and drying equipment. The physical demands of this labor affected every woman differently. Younger inmates initially withstood the strain better, though years of repetitive motion caused early arthritis and joint problems. Older women struggled with the heavy lifting and prolonged standing. The chemical solutions used for stain removal and bleaching caused skin irritation, burns when splashed, and respiratory problems from breathing fumes in poorly ventilated spaces. Women handled scalding linens fresh from boiling, risking burns on their hands and arms. The industrial equipment included mangles, large rollers that pressed water from wet laundry, which could catch clothing or hair if operators lost focus during long shifts. Contact with the outside world existed only at the institution's discretion. Letters from family required the nuns' approval to reach inmates, and all correspondence faced censorship. Women could write letters only under supervision, with nuns reading every word before deciding whether to mail them. Many letters never reached their intended recipients. Family visits, when permitted, occurred in supervised settings where conversations could be monitored. Some facilities allowed monthly visits, others quarterly, and some prohibited visits entirely for the first year or longer. Women had no way to make telephone calls, no access to newspapers or information about events beyond the walls, no calendar marking their potential release. The absence of legal documentation governing these detentions created an administrative void that served the institution's interests. Unlike prisons, which maintained formal sentences and release dates, the Magdalene Laundries operated without such structures. Women received no written documentation explaining the terms of their confinement, no contracts detailing expectations or timelines, no legal framework establishing their rights. The nuns held absolute authority over every aspect of daily life, from wake-up times to meal portions to work assignments to decisions about when or whether a woman had been sufficiently reformed to warrant release. This lack of formal process meant women had no recourse for complaints or appeals. If they believed their detention was unjust, they had no court to approach. If they felt ready to leave, they had no authority to petition, except the very nuns who benefited from their continued labor. If they suffered injuries or fell ill, they had no independent medical advocate. The isolation was complete, both physical and legal. Some women arrived believing they would stay only weeks or months. They discovered, gradually, that time operated differently inside these walls. Months became years, years became decades, and the world they had known faded into increasingly distant memory. The rhythmic routine of prayer, work, meals, and sleep marked time's passage. But without clear milestones or endpoints, days blurred together into an endless present, where yesterday and tomorrow held no meaningful distinction. The machinery of confinement ran smoothly because it served multiple interests simultaneously. Religious orders gained free labor and substantial income. Families avoided scandal and social consequences. Society disposed of women it found inconvenient or problematic. And the women themselves, stripped of names, rights, and connections to the outside world, became invisible. Behind high walls topped with broken glass, they had become something new. Profitable shadows, generating wealth they would never share, doing penance for sins, often committed by others. The ledgers told a story the nuns never shared from their pulpits. Financial records from Dublin's largest Magdalene laundry in 1862 revealed annual revenues exceeding £3,000, equivalent to roughly £400,000 in modern currency. The facility processed laundry for 12 hotels, 3 hospitals, the city's main railway station, and over 40 wealthy households. The labor force consisted of 86 women who received no wages, no portion of profits, and no compensation beyond bare subsistence. The mathematical reality was stark. Every penny of revenue represented pure profit, minus only the minimal costs of food, building maintenance, and the nuns' own living expenses. The business model depended entirely on captive labor, operating under conditions no commercial laundry could replicate. Regular laundries paid workers' wages, maintained reasonable hours to comply with emerging labor regulations, and faced competition that constrained their pricing. The Magdalene laundries faced none of these limitations. Women worked as many hours as orders demanded, received no payment, had no ability to quit or negotiate conditions, and could be disciplined without fear of losing workers to competitors. This allowed the religious orders to undercut commercial laundries by 30 to 50% while maintaining profit margins that made these institutions extraordinarily lucrative. The commercial contracts reveal how thoroughly integrated these facilities became in Ireland's economy. Hotels relied on Magdalene laundries for their linens, appreciating both the low cost and the reliability of an institution that never faced labor strikes or worker shortages. Hospitals sent surgical linens, patient bedding, and staff uniforms, requiring the rapid turnaround these facilities could provide through extended work hours. Wealthy families established standing accounts, sending regular shipments of household laundry, table linens, and clothing. The railway companies contracted for porter uniforms and passenger car bedding. Government institutions, including workhouses and some administrative offices, became clients despite their theoretical oversight responsibilities for charitable institutions. The financial arrangements varied, but shared common elements. Most clients paid monthly based on weight or item count, with premium rates for rush orders or specialty cleaning. The religious orders negotiated multi-year contracts that provided stable, predictable revenue streams. Some facilities offered discounts to Catholic institutions and clergy, effectively subsidizing church operations with profits generated by captive women's labor. The orders invested these profits in expanding their laundry operations, purchasing more advanced equipment, acquiring additional properties, and funding other institutional activities. The stark contrast between the orders accumulating wealth and the women's poverty revealed the system's true nature. While religious orders built substantial property holdings and maintained comfortable living quarters for the nuns, the women who generated this wealth lived in austere dormitories with minimal heating, basic bedding, and crowded conditions. Meals consisted of the cheapest possible ingredients sufficient to maintain work capacity, but offering no variety or nutrition beyond bare necessity. Medical care came only when injuries or illnesses threatened to reduce productivity, with no preventative treatment or attention to chronic conditions that developed from years of harsh labor. The equipment itself reflected these priorities. The religious orders invested in industrial machinery that increased processing capacity and efficiency, viewing these purchases as capital improvements that would generate returns through higher volume. They spent nothing on safety equipment, ventilation systems, or ergonomic designs that might protect workers. Women operated dangerous mangles without guards, handled caustic chemicals without protective gear, worked in steam-filled rooms without adequate air circulation, and lifted heavy loads without mechanical assistance. Each equipment purchase decision prioritized productivity over human welfare, a calculation possible only because the workers had no power to demand better conditions. The economic incentives created by this system actively discouraged releasing women. Each inmate represented productive capacity, generating revenue at zero labor cost. Keeping women longer meant extracting more unpaid work, accumulating more profit, and maintaining higher processing volume to attract additional commercial contracts. The religious rhetoric about moral reformation and readiness for release masked financial motivations for indefinite detention. Some women spent decades in these facilities, not because they required extended moral education, but because releasing them would reduce the institution's profitable labor force. The religious orders justified this arrangement through theological frameworks that recast exploitation as spiritual service. They claimed women were working off their moral debts, learning discipline and humility, engaging in penitential labor that would purify their souls. The absence of wages became portrayed as teaching women to value things beyond money, to find satisfaction in honest work regardless of compensation. The harsh conditions were presented as necessary asceticism, stripping away worldly attachments to reveal spiritual truth. Every element of economic exploitation received religious justification that transformed captivity into salvation. Government authorities, when they considered these institutions at all, viewed them as self-sustaining charitable operations, requiring no public funding, and therefore deserving no articular scrutiny. The fact that religious orders ran profitable businesses using unpaid captive labor apparently raised no concerns among officials, who might have questioned similar arrangements in secular contexts. The combination of religious authority, economic self-sufficiency, and social utility in managing problematic women created a perfect shield against regulatory oversight. Behind the chapel walls and beneath the crosses mounted on industrial buildings, the Magdalene Laundries had perfected a system that would operate profitably for over a century, converting human suffering into financial gain while maintaining the appearance of charitable works. Victorian Ireland operated on an unspoken agreement. Some women simply needed to vanish. The social machinery that fed women into Magdalene Laundries extended far beyond the religious orders running these institutions. Families, clergy, magistrates, physicians, and ordinary citizens all participated in a system that made problematic women disappear while maintaining plausible deniability about their destinations. This collective amnesia served everyone's interests except the women themselves, creating a network of complicity that spanned every level of Irish society and ensured the laundries remained fully populated for over a century. The most common pathway began in family parlors, when fathers discovered daughters were pregnant outside marriage. In Victorian Ireland, illegitimate pregnancy brought catastrophic social consequences. The family's reputation would be destroyed, younger siblings' marriage prospects ruined, the fathers standing in church, and community devastated. The pregnant woman herself faced complete social exile, unlikely to ever marry respectably or secure decent employment. Faced with this prospect, families sought solutions that would hide the pregnancy before neighbors noticed the physical signs becoming obvious. The local priest typically facilitated the arrangement, speaking quietly with the Mother Superior at the nearest Magdalene laundry and arranging admission. The family would tell neighbors the daughter had gone to work as a domestic servant in another county, or to care for an ill relative, or to study with nuns in a distant convent. These explanations satisfied casual inquiries while obscuring the truth. The daughter would depart quietly, often at night, and her name would gradually fade from local conversation. If neighbors asked after her months or years later, families offered vague reassurances that she was doing well elsewhere, maintaining the fiction until it became accepted fact. The legal system provided another major channel. Magistrates faced regular cases of petty theft, prostitution, public drunkenness, or vagrancy involving women. Traditional punishments like jail sentences seemed inappropriate to Victorian sensibilities regarding female offenders. The Magdalene Laundries offered a solution that appeared more humane than prison, while actually imposing indefinite detention without trial protections. Courts could sentence women to these institutions for minor offenses that might warrant weeks or months in jail. Yet the women would remain for years with no legal mechanism to challenge their continued confinement. Some referrals came from physicians and asylum doctors who encountered women they deemed mentally unstable, overly emotional, or insufficiently compliant with male authority. The medical profession in the 19th century had broad latitude to diagnose women as hysterical, melancholic, or morally insane based on behaviors that challenged social norms. Women who refused arranged marriages, questioned religious doctrine too persistently, expressed anger at mistreatment, or displayed independence their families found unseemly could find themselves labeled as requiring institutional intervention for their own good. The broader public maintained willful ignorance while directly benefiting from the system. Middle-class households and businesses received affordable laundry services, appreciating the reliable quality and low prices, without inquiring about the labor arrangements that made such rates possible. When people encountered the distinctive laundry wagons making deliveries throughout cities and towns, they knew these came from institutions housing fallen women. But social etiquette discouraged discussing such matters openly. The laundries existed in a peculiar social space. Everyone knew about them, yet polite society never acknowledged them in conversation. This deliberate blindness extended to obvious inconsistencies. Women entered these institutions, ostensibly for temporary reformation and training, yet rarely emerged. Families who sent daughters to Magdalene Laundries often lost contact with them entirely, receiving no letters, allowed no visits, given no information about their welfare or potential release dates. The complete absence of transparency should have raised questions, but instead, people accepted the religious order's authority and avoided asking uncomfortable questions that might require acknowledging the system's true nature. The few voices that challenged this arrangement faced swift social consequences. Family members who demanded their relatives' release encountered institutional stonewalling and community pressure to stop making trouble. Former inmates who attempted to speak about their experiences found their testimony dismissed as unreliable complaints from morally compromised women. Journalists who investigated conditions in these facilities faced ecclesiastical pressure and threats of libel suits from wealthy religious orders with sophisticated legal representation. The Catholic Church's immense social power in Ireland made resistance particularly difficult. Priests could influence employment, education, and marriage prospects. Speaking against church-run institutions risked being labeled anti-Catholic or irreligious, accusations that could destroy someone's social standing and economic opportunities. Most people chose silence over confrontation, prioritizing their own interests over the welfare of distant, unknown women locked behind convent walls. This web of complicity created a self-reinforcing system. As more families used the laundries to hide pregnancies, it became normalized as the appropriate response. As courts routinely referred female offenders to these institutions, it established legal precedent. As the public continued purchasing their services, it provided economic sustainability. Each participant could claim they were simply following established practice, avoiding personal responsibility for maintaining a system of exploitation. The women trapped inside understood this collective abandonment. They recognized that their families, their communities, and their society had deliberately chosen to forget them, finding their disappearance more convenient than their continued existence in the regular world. This knowledge, perhaps more than the physical labor or harsh conditions inflicted the deepest wounds. Victorian Ireland had perfected the art of making inconvenient women vanish while maintaining the appearance of Christian charity, and everyone benefited except the women themselves. By 1875, some women had been washing laundry behind convent walls for over 30 years. The first generation of Magdalene laundry inmates had entered these institutions as young women in the 1840s and 50s, expecting brief stays for reformation before returning to society. By the 1870s and 80s, many remained inside, now approaching or past middle age, having spent the majority of their adult lives in captivity. They represented a phenomenon the religious orders never publicly acknowledged: women who had effectively been sentenced to life imprisonment for offenses that in any other context would have warranted minimal punishment or no legal intervention whatsoever. The psychological transformation that occurred over decades of confinement proved profound and irreversible for many inmates. Women who entered at 18 or 20, still possessing memories of family life, personal ambitions, and identities independent of institutional labels, gradually lost these connections as years accumulated. The rigid daily routine, the absence of personal choice, the systematic erasure of individual identity through numbers and imposed names, all worked to reshape their understanding of themselves. After 10 years, women struggled to remember what freedom felt like, and after 20 years, some could no longer imagine functioning outside the institution's structure. The religious orders occasionally offered release to women who had spent decades inside, but many refused or returned within months. This phenomenon, which the nuns cited as evidence that the women were genuinely reformed and chose to remain, actually revealed the success of their institutional control. Women who had spent their entire adult lives under constant supervision, following rigid schedules, making no independent decisions about even basic matters like when to eat or sleep, found themselves utterly unprepared for autonomous existence. They had no money, no work references beyond laundry labor, no social connections outside the institution, often no family willing to acknowledge them after decades of absence. Returning to the laundry represented the only stability they knew. The treatment of pregnancy within these institutions added another layer of tragedy. Women sent to Magdalene laundries, specifically because they were pregnant, gave birth within the facilities, typically receiving minimal medical attention during labor. The religious orders maintained that allowing women to keep their children would reward immoral behavior and perpetuate sin. Infants were removed shortly after birth and placed for adoption, often with Catholic families who could provide proper moral guidance. Mothers received no information about where their children went, whether they were healthy, or any means to maintain contact. This severance was presented as merciful, protecting innocent children from contamination by their mother's fallen status. The emotional devastation of this forced separation affected women differently. Some became withdrawn and silent, performing their work mechanically while retreating into private grief. Others developed what physicians of the era would have termed melancholia or hysteria, exhibiting symptoms of severe depression that the institutions addressed through increased labor and prayer rather than medical intervention. A few women broke entirely under the combined stress of childbirth, infant removal, and continued indefinite detention, developing conditions that made them even less capable of ever leaving the institution. Death came regularly to the Magdalene laundries, though the religious orders maintained minimal documentation about mortality within their walls. Tuberculosis spread easily in the crowded dormitories, and poorly ventilated workrooms, killing women whose weakened constitutions, from years of inadequate nutrition and harsh labor, left them vulnerable to infection. Accidents with industrial equipment caused injuries that, without proper medical treatment, led to fatal infections. Older women suffered heart failure or strokes brought on by physical strain and stress. The cumulative toll of years of exposure to harsh chemicals, repetitive manual labor, and chronic exhaustion simply wore bodies down until they failed the burial. Practices revealed how thoroughly these institutions dehumanized their inmates, even in death. Most Magdalene laundries maintained cemeteries on their grounds, consecrated spaces where deceased women were interred. However, many graves received no proper markers, or only simple wooden crosses that weathered away within decades. The religious orders kept some internal records of burials, but these often lacked complete information, listing only the religious name assigned by the institution rather than the woman's birth name. This meant families who might have sought information about lost relatives decades later found no way to locate or identify their graves. Some women died having spent 40, 50, even 60 years inside these institutions. They had entered as teenagers during the reign of Queen Victoria and died in the early 20th century, having witnessed massive social and technological changes only through the filtered lens of institutional control. They never voted, never owned property, never made independent life choices, never experienced romantic relationships, never traveled freely, never pursued personal interests or ambitions. Their entire adult existence had been compressed into the narrow space between chapel and laundry room. The tragedy extended beyond individual suffering to the complete waste of human potential. These were women who might have become teachers, writers, business owners, mothers, who raised their own children, contributors to their communities in countless ways. Instead, their lives had been reduced to generating profits for religious orders through unpaid labor, their identities erased so thoroughly that even their final resting places carried no trace of who they had actually been. The religious orders claimed they were saving souls, but the evidence suggested they were destroying lives. By the late 19th century, the Magdalene Laundries had created an entire hidden population of women who existed in a twilight space between life and death, physically present but socially erased, working endlessly in institutions that took everything and gave nothing in return. Behind the walls, a generation had been lost to steam and stone, and no one was counting the cost. The government inspector's report from 1889 contained a single paragraph about the Magdalene Laundries. These institutions operate under religious authority and require no civil oversight. That administrative decision, replicated across decades and multiple government agencies, created a documentary void that would make it impossible to ever fully account for what happened behind convent walls. While prisons maintained detailed registers of every inmate, recording admission dates, sentences, infractions, and releases, the Magdalene Laundries operated without such requirements. While hospitals kept patient records and orphanages documented children in their care, these religious institutions faced no mandates to maintain comprehensive records or make them available for inspection. This absence of documentation was not accidental oversight, but deliberate policy that served the interests of everyone except the women whose lives disappeared into unrecorded history. The admission registers that did exist revealed more through their gaps than their contents. A ledger from a Cork facility covering 1875 to 1890 showed entries for 163 women, but 47 entries contained only a number and admission date with no other information recorded. Names appeared inconsistently, sometimes a first name only, sometimes the religious name assigned by the institution, occasionally a surname. Reasons for admission, when listed at all, used vague terminology like moral reformation or voluntary penitent that conveyed no actual information about circumstances. Expected duration of stay appeared in almost no entries, reflecting the reality that women had no defined sentences. Death records proved even more problematic. When women died within Magdalene Laundries, religious orders had discretion about what information to report to civil authorities. Some facilities maintained internal burial registers, but these contained minimal detail and used the institutional names rather than birth names. This created situations where families seeking information about deceased relatives decades later found themselves unable to locate or identify graves because the names in cemetery records matched no one they knew. Civil death certificates, when filed at all, often listed only the religious order's address, rather than identifying the deceased as a Magdalene Laundry inmate, obscuring the institutional nature of these deaths from statistical analysis. Government inspectors who might have provided oversight faced institutional barriers and cultural resistance. Religious orders claimed ecclesiastical privilege, arguing that civil authorities had no jurisdiction over church-run charitable institutions. Government officials, many of them devout Catholics reluctant to challenge church authority, generally accepted these claims without serious challenge. The few inspections that occurred followed advance notice, giving institutions time to prepare, and focused on physical infrastructure, like building safety, rather than investigating the treatment of inmates or examining the justification for their detention. This lack of oversight meant women had no mechanism to appeal their confinement or report mistreatment. In prisons, inmates could petition for sentence review, file complaints about conditions, or seek legal representation. Women in Magdalene Laundries had no such options. They could not write to government officials because all their correspondence faced censorship. They could not petition courts because courts had no acknowledged jurisdiction over these institutions. They could not contact lawyers because they had no money to pay for legal representation and no access to communication with the outside world. Families seeking information about relatives faced coordinated institutional obstruction. When family members wrote requesting details about a daughter or sister, religious orders responded with generic assurances that she was doing well and continuing her reformation, providing no specific information about her welfare, location within the institution, or prospects for release. Requests for visits often went unanswered or were denied with vague references to the woman not being ready for family contact. In some cases, institutions claimed they had no record of the woman in question, even when families possessed documentation showing she had been sent there years earlier. This documentary erasure served multiple purposes. It prevented external verification of conditions inside these institutions, making it impossible to investigate claims of mistreatment. It eliminated paper trails that might reveal the scale of profit generated through unpaid labor. It allowed religious orders to present whatever narrative they chose about their charitable works, without fear of contradiction from official records. Most importantly, it made the women themselves historically invisible, erasing their experiences so thoroughly that reconstructing the truth decades later would prove nearly impossible. The few documents that survived often contradicted official narratives. Private papers discovered in the 1990s included letters from nuns discussing the profitable nature of laundry operations, correspondence about purchasing additional industrial equipment to increase capacity, and internal memos about managing women who had become too physically weak to work effectively. These materials, never intended for outside eyes, revealed awareness that the institutions operated primarily as businesses exploiting captive labor rather than charitable reformation programs. The absence of systematic record-keeping also meant no one could accurately count how many women passed through these institutions over their operational history. Estimates range from 10,000 to 30,000 women in Ireland alone across the Laundries' 175 years of operation. But the true number remains unknown and unknowable due to incomplete and destroyed records. Each gap in documentation represents women whose suffering left no historical trace, whose years of captivity generated no acknowledgement, whose deaths created no lasting memorial. The documentary silence was itself a form of institutional violence, denying women even the dignity of having their existence and suffering officially recognized. They had been erased from history as thoroughly as they had been erased from their families and communities, reduced to shadows whose fading presence served only to increase the institution's mystery. Behind the walls, women lived, worked, and died without creating ripples in the official Kia record, making it easy for a nation to later claim it never knew what was happening. A physician's private journal from 1893 described examining a 40-year-old woman from a Dublin Magdalene laundry whose hands were so scarred and deformed she could barely hold a cup. The doctor noted she had entered the institution at age 17, meaning 23 years of laundry work had transformed healthy hands into twisted appendages covered in chemical burns, calluses thick as leather, and joints swollen from chronic arthritis. The examination revealed respiratory problems from years of breathing chemical fumes, a persistent cough suggesting tuberculosis, severe malnutrition despite claims of adequate institutional meals, and what the physician termed profound melancholia, evident in her inability to make eye contact or respond to questions. The doctor's assessment concluded she was medically unfit for continued labor, yet the institution returned her to work the following week. His journal entry ended with a question: how many more like her exist behind those walls? The physical demands of industrial laundry work under Victorian conditions caused predictable patterns of deterioration across the inmate population. Women stood for 12 to 16 hours daily, leading to chronic leg pain, varicose veins, and back problems that worsened progressively over years. The repetitive motions of scrubbing, wringing, lifting heavy wet linens, and operating mangles caused severe arthritis in hands, wrists, elbows, and shoulders, often becoming debilitating by middle age. The constant exposure to water kept hands perpetually damp and wrinkled, causing skin to crack and develop infections that rarely healed properly. Without medical attention, the institutions did not provide. The chemical solutions used for stain removal and bleaching posed serious health hazards. 19th-century laundries relied on harsh substances, including lye, ammonia, and chlorine-based bleaches that workers handled without protective equipment. Direct contact caused chemical burns on skin, particularly hands and forearms, where splashing occurred most frequently. Breathing the fumes in poorly ventilated workrooms led to respiratory irritation, chronic coughing, and progressive lung damage. Women who spent decades exposed to these chemicals developed breathing difficulties that worsened with age, leaving many gasping for air after minimal physical exertion by their 40s or 50s. The temperature extremes in laundry facilities created additional health problems, Washrooms maintained near scalding temperatures due to boiling water and steam, while drying rooms became even hotter as women worked among heated equipment. These conditions caused heat exhaustion during summer months, with women collapsing at their stations. Conversely, unheated dormitories and work areas in winter exposed inmates to severe cold that exacerbated respiratory illnesses and joint pain. The constant movement between hot work areas and cold spaces contributed to illness, as sweating women moved into frigid rooms without opportunity to change into dry clothing. Tuberculosis spread efficiently through the Magdalene Laundries, thriving in the crowded dormitories where women slept in close quarters with minimal ventilation. The disease moved from inmate to inmate, causing chronic coughing, weight loss, fever, and eventually, death in many cases. The institution's practice of maintaining work schedules regardless of illness meant infected women continued laboring while contagious, spreading infection to others. The combination of poor nutrition, physical exhaustion, and constant exposure to dampness and cold made women particularly vulnerable to tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases. Injuries from industrial equipment occurred with grim regularity. The mangles used to press water from wet laundry consisted of large rollers that could catch fingers, hands, or even arms if operators lost concentration during long shifts. Women suffered crushed fingers, broken bones, and severe bruising from these machines. Hot irons caused burns when exhausted workers made mistakes or equipment malfunctioned. Slips on wet floors led to falls resulting in sprains, fractures, and head injuries. Without proper medical care, many injuries healed poorly, or not at all, leaving permanent damage that further reduced women's physical capacity. The nutritional inadequacy of institutional meals manifested in multiple ways. Women received food sufficient to maintain basic function, but lacking variety or adequate calories for the physical labor demanded. Chronic malnutrition led to anemia, making women weak and dizzy. Vitamin deficiencies caused specific conditions, including scurvy from lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, rickets from insufficient vitamin D and sunlight exposure, and pellagra from protein-poor diets. Dental problems proliferated without access to dental care, causing tooth loss and infections that affected overall health. The psychological toll proved as devastating as the physical damage. Women who had spent years or decades in captivity, separated from family, stripped of identity, subjected to endless labor, and denied any meaningful human connection, developed severe depression. Some became effectively catatonic, performing work mechanically while showing no emotional response or initiative. Others experienced what Victorian physicians would have diagnosed as hysteria or nervous exhaustion, manifesting in emotional outbursts, physical tremors, or withdrawal from interaction. The institutions addressed these conditions not through medical intervention, but through increased isolation and demands for greater religious devotion. Medical care, when provided at all, focused on maintaining work capacity rather than treating underlying conditions or providing comfort. A woman who became too ill to work might receive a few days of rest, but chronic conditions went largely ignored. The religious orders viewed physical suffering as spiritually beneficial, teaching humility and acceptance of divine will. This theological perspective meant that alleviating pain or improving conditions was actually seen as interfering with the women's moral reformation. The mortality records from facilities that maintained them showed death rates significantly higher than comparable populations outside institutional settings. Women died younger than average, succumbed to preventable diseases at higher rates, and suffered fatal accidents that proper safety measures could have avoided. Their bodies, weakened by years of harsh labor, inadequate nutrition, and untreated medical conditions, simply failed earlier and more catastrophically than they should have under humane conditions. By the early 20th century, the accumulated physical toll on Magdalene laundry inmates represented a public health crisis that no one acknowledged because these women remained invisible to official scrutiny. They were breaking down one body at a time, their suffering hidden behind walls that the broader society chose not to look past. The institutions called it reformation, but the evidence suggested it was systematic destruction of human health in pursuit of profit. In 1907, a woman named Ellen Kerwin walked into a Dublin newspaper office claiming she had spent 18 years locked inside a Magdalene laundry for the crime of refusing an arranged marriage. The journalist who interviewed her noted extensive scarring on her hands, a persistent cough, and visible trembling when she described the conditions inside. Her account detailed endless labor without pay, women dying from preventable illnesses, children being removed from their mothers, and a system of punishment that kept inmates compliant through fear and exhaustion. The newspaper declined to publish her testimony. The editor's notes on her interview file read, "Claims seem exaggerated. Subject appears unstable. Story would offend Catholic readership." Ellen Kerwin's attempt to expose what she had experienced ended like most others, in silence. The paths out of Magdalene laundries were few and treacherous. Some women gained release through persistent family advocacy, though this required relatives who maintained contact despite institutional discouragement, and possessed the social influence to pressure religious orders into granting freedom. These releases typically came after years of negotiation, with families sometimes required to make financial payments framed as donations for the woman's care. Other women reached arbitrary release dates known only to the nuns, suddenly informed after a decade or more that they were free to leave, thrust into a world they no longer understood, with no preparation or support. A handful of women escaped through more dramatic means. They climbed walls under cover of darkness, slipped away during rare supervised excursions, or simply walked out through unlocked gates when opportunity presented itself. These escapes carried enormous risks. Women had no money, no identification documents, often no knowledge of how to navigate cities that had changed during their years of confinement. Many were recaptured within days and returned to face increased restrictions. A few succeeded in disappearing into other communities, adopting new identities to avoid being found and forced back. The challenges facing women who left these institutions proved overwhelming. They possessed no work references beyond laundry experience from a stigmatized institution. Employers viewed them with suspicion, assuming moral deficiency had led to their confinement. They had no savings after years of unpaid labor, making it impossible to secure housing or support themselves during job searches. Their families, if they maintained any contact, often remained ashamed and unwilling to acknowledge them publicly. The social stigma of having been a Magdalene laundry inmate followed women throughout their lives, marking them as fallen, regardless of their actual circumstances or the injustice of their detention. Those who attempted to share their experiences encountered systematic dismissal. When survivors approached journalists, their testimonies were rejected as unreliable complaints from women of questionable character. When they contacted government officials, their allegations received responses claiming no jurisdiction over religious institutions. When they sought legal representation to pursue claims against the orders that had detained them, lawyers explained that ecclesiastical privilege and statutes of limitations made such cases impossible to pursue successfully. The same social forces that had made their initial disappearance acceptable ensured their subsequent testimony remained unheard. The few accounts that did receive limited public attention faced coordinated institutional responses designed to discredit the speakers. Religious orders issued statements characterizing former inmates as ungrateful individuals, attacking the very institutions that had tried to help them. Clergy questioned the mental stability and moral reliability of women, making such claims. Catholic publications published editorials defending the Magdalene Laundries as charitable works, being unfairly maligned by those too morally compromised to appreciate the Reformation efforts made on their behalf. This coordinated defense proved effective in maintaining the institution's reputations against survivor testimony. Some survivors found each other, forming informal networks of women who had experienced similar trauma and understood what others had endured. These connections provided emotional support, but offered little practical assistance in achieving justice or public acknowledgement. The women shared stories in private, confirmed each other's experiences, and validated feelings of anger and betrayal that society dismissed as bitterness. These networks remained largely invisible to the public, operating in the same shadows where the women themselves had been forced to exist. The psychological damage from years of captivity made it difficult for many survivors to function in regular society. They struggled with basic decision-making after decades of having every choice made for them. They experienced anxiety in crowds after years of controlled isolation. They found intimate relationships nearly impossible after systematic dehumanization and forced separation from any meaningful human connection. Some developed what later generations would recognize as complex trauma responses, experiencing flashbacks, nightmares, and overwhelming emotional reactions triggered by reminders of their captivity. A small number of survivors maintained detailed private records of their experiences, writing accounts they hoped might someday contribute to exposing the truth. These manuscripts, discovered decades later among personal papers after their deaths, provided some of the most comprehensive documentation of conditions inside the Magdalene Laundries. The writers never saw their testimonies published or acknowledged during their lifetimes, dying without recognition of the suffering they had documented. The pattern remained consistent across generations. Women left the institutions, attempted to tell their stories, encountered institutional and social resistance, and ultimately retreated into silence. Their testimony existed, but remained unheard. Their evidence accumulated, but stayed unexamined. Their truth persisted, but went unacknowledged. The walls that had contained their bodies proved less effective than the social mechanisms that contained their voices. By the mid-20th century, hundreds of women had escaped or been released from Magdalene Laundries, but their collective testimony had failed to generate any meaningful investigation or reform. The institutions continued, operating with minor modifications, processing new generations of women through the same system that previous survivors had tried desperately to expose. The conspiracy of silence that had enabled the Laundries' creation remained strong enough to suppress the voices of those who had experienced its worst effects firsthand. The last woman entered a Magdalene laundry in 1995, 174 years after the first institution opened its doors. While the world around these facilities transformed beyond recognition, computers replacing typewriters, airplanes connecting continents, satellites orbiting Earth, and human rights becoming internationally codified principles, The fundamental operations inside Magdalene Laundries remained eerily consistent with their Victorian origins. Women still lost their names, still worked without wages, still faced indefinite detention decided by religious authority, still had their children removed, still lived behind walls and they could not leave freely. The system had proven remarkably resistant to change, adapting just enough to avoid closure while maintaining its core function of making inconvenient women disappear. The 20th century brought modifications that allowed the institutions to continue operating despite evolving social attitudes. The religious orders updated their public messaging, shifting from explicit moral reformation language to therapeutic terminology about providing refuge for vulnerable women. They modernized equipment, replacing some manual labor with industrial machinery, though still relying on unpaid inmate labor to operate it. They reduced the most visible forms of harsh treatment after occasional critical newspaper articles, but maintained the fundamental structure of captivity and exploitation. The walls remained high, the gates stayed locked, and women inside still had no legal recourse or independent oversight. The inmate population shifted somewhat across decades, though the underlying pattern of targeting women who challenged social norms persisted. The 1920s and 30s saw continued admissions of unmarried pregnant women, with social stigma around illegitimacy remaining powerful despite broader cultural changes. The 1940s and 50s brought women deemed sexually promiscuous, those who had been assaulted and were viewed as contaminated, and those whose families found them too difficult to manage. The 60s through 90s included women with developmental or intellectual disabilities, whom families or institutions found inconvenient, survivors of abuse being hidden away rather than protected, and teenagers whose only offense was being too independent or questioning authority. The persistence of these institutions, despite massive social progress elsewhere, revealed deep resistance to acknowledging or addressing the system. Ireland's independence in 1922 did not bring increased oversight of religious institutions. The women's suffrage movement and subsequent waves of feminism somehow failed to shine sustained light on the Magdalene Laundries, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 1948, which prohibited arbitrary detention and forced labor, apparently did not apply to women behind convent walls. International human rights organizations that scrutinized authoritarian regimes never examined these Catholic institutions operating in democratic Ireland. Several factors explain this extraordinary longevity. The Catholic Church maintained enormous social and political power in Ireland throughout the 20th century, making serious criticism of church-run institutions politically dangerous. Successive governments found the laundries convenient for managing women who would otherwise require state support or intervention, essentially outsourcing social control to religious orders. The institution's economic self-sufficiency through commercial laundry operations meant they required no public funding, and thus attracted no budgetary scrutiny. Most importantly, the continued social stigma around illegitimate pregnancy, female sexuality, and women who violated moral norms meant families still wanted places to hide daughters who brought shame. Media attention remained sporadic and ineffective. Occasional newspaper articles questioning conditions in Magdalene Laundries appeared in the 1960s and 70s, but generated limited public outrage and no government action. Television documentaries in the 1980s interviewed some survivors, but their testimony faced the same dismissal that had silenced earlier generations. The religious order's public relations responses emphasized their charitable mission while characterizing critics as anti-Catholic, a charge that carried real consequences in deeply religious Ireland. The first cracks in the system's armor appeared in the late 1980s and early 1990s, driven by several converging forces. Survivor advocacy groups gained strength and media sophistication, learning how to frame their stories in ways that generated public sympathy rather than dismissal. Investigative journalists began examining financial records and property holdings, revealing the substantial wealth religious orders had accumulated through these institutions. International human rights organizations finally began asking questions about Ireland's treatment of women in institutional settings. Most significantly, the Catholic Church's authority was weakening due to emerging scandals about other forms of institutional abuse, creating space for criticism that would have been impossible in earlier decades. Individual Magdalene laundries began closing in the 1970s and 80s, not from government pressure, but from changing economics. The commercial laundry business faced increasing competition from modern facilities, with paid workers and better equipment maintaining. Aging buildings became expensive. The supply of women being sent to these institutions decreased as social attitudes about pregnancy outside marriage gradually became less punitive. However, several facilities continued operating, processing diminishing, but still steady numbers of women through a system that should have been dismantled generations earlier. The final Irish Magdalene laundry closed in 1996 when the last remaining facility in Dublin shut its doors. The closure received minimal news coverage, treated as the end of an outdated institution rather than the termination of a human rights violation that had persisted for nearly 2 centuries. The religious order that ran it issued a statement thanking God for allowing them to serve vulnerable women for so many years, making no acknowledgement of wrongdoing or apology to survivors. By the time that final gate closed, thousands of women had passed through these institutions across multiple generations, spanning from the reign of Queen Victoria to the age of the Internet. The system had outlived every justification offered for its existence, surviving through institutional inertia, deliberate blindness, and society's continued willingness to disappear women. It found problematic. Behind walls that finally came down, the last survivors walked free into a world that had not yet acknowledged what had been done to them. In 1993, construction workers breaking ground for a housing development in Dublin struck something that stopped the project immediately. Human remains in unmarked graves, numbering in the hundreds. The site had been owned by a religious order that operated a Magdalene laundry for over a century before selling the property. The order had disclosed no information about burials when negotiating the sale. Forensic archaeologists called to examine the site discovered grave after grave containing women's bodies, some buried in mass plots, others in individual graves marked only with numbers or not marked at all. Some remains showed evidence of severe malnutrition. Others displayed bone damage consistent with repetitive manual labor and untreated injuries. Several bodies had been placed in coffins designed for children, despite being adult women, a cost-saving measure that forced remains into cramped positions. The discovery made international headlines and finally cracked open a truth that Irish society had successfully ignored for nearly 2 centuries. Similar discoveries followed at other former Magdalene laundry sites across Ireland. Archaeological investigations revealed systematic patterns of burial without proper documentation, identification, or family notification. Women who died in these institutions were interred in consecrated ground on the properties, but the religious orders maintained minimal records about who was buried where. In many cases, graves were marked with the institutional names rather than birth names, making identification impossible for families who might have sought information decades later. Some cemeteries contained infants and young children, evidence of the pregnancies that had sent women to these institutions and the children removed from them. The mass grave discoveries triggered what decades of survivor testimony had failed to achieve: government investigation. The Irish government established commissions to examine the Magdalene Laundries, their operations, and the treatment of women within them. These inquiries faced immediate challenges. The religious orders had destroyed or refused to release many records. Surviving documents contained massive gaps and inconsistencies. Many potential witnesses had died, taking their knowledge to graves that were themselves difficult to locate or identify. Nevertheless, the investigations gradually assembled a picture that confirmed what survivors had been saying all along. The official reports, released in the early 2000s, acknowledged systematic human rights violations spanning over a century. They confirmed that thousands of women had been detained without legal process, forced to work without pay, subjected to harsh conditions, and denied basic dignities. The reports documented the economic exploitation of unpaid labor, the negligent medical care that caused preventable deaths, the psychological trauma of indefinite detention, and the complete absence of government oversight that had allowed these conditions to persist for generations. Most significantly, the investigations acknowledged that both religious and civil authorities had known about these problems and chosen to do nothing. The revelations forced responses that previous generations of survivors never witnessed. The Irish government issued formal apologies, acknowledging the state's failure to protect vulnerable women and its complicity in maintaining a system of institutionalized exploitation. Religious orders issued their own apologies, though these varied widely in their willingness to accept responsibility versus framing the Laundries as well-intentioned institutions that reflected the attitudes of their times. Compensation schemes were established, though survivors and advocates argued the financial payments were inadequate given the scale and duration of harm. Memorials appeared at former Magdalene laundry sites, marking what had occurred there and honoring the women who had suffered. Museums and educational programs incorporated the laundry's history into broader examinations of institutional abuse in Ireland. Academic researchers produced scholarly analyses examining how such systematic exploitation could persist in a democratic society for nearly 200 years. Survivor testimony finally received the public hearing and validation that earlier generations had been denied. The legacy of the Magdalene Laundries extends beyond the specific institutions to reveal uncomfortable truths about how societies treat vulnerable women. These facilities thrived because they served multiple interests simultaneously. Religious orders gained wealth and influence, families disposed of shameful problems, governments avoided responsibility for social welfare, and broader society eliminated women. It found inconvenient or threatening. The system worked perfectly for everyone except the women themselves, and that imbalance proved sustainable for nearly 2 centuries because those with power had no incentive to change it. The story exposes what happens when religious authority combines with social prejudice, economic exploitation, and government negligence to create institutions that operate beyond accountability. It demonstrates how easily violations of human rights can be normalized when they target already marginalized groups. It reveals the dangers of allowing any institution to operate without independent oversight, transparency, or mechanisms for those inside to seek help or justice. The thousands of women who passed through Magdalene Laundries The hundreds buried in unmarked graves, the survivors who spent decades trying to tell their stories, all serve as reminders that societies must actively protect vulnerable populations rather than creating systems to hide them away. Their suffering stands as evidence that charitable rhetoric and religious authority cannot substitute for genuine compassion, legal protections, and respect for human dignity. Behind those walls that finally came down, generations of women had their lives stolen, their identities erased, and their suffering converted into profit, while the world looked away. The graves that forced a reckoning contained only a fraction of those who had been trapped there, but their discovery finally made it impossible for Ireland to continue denying what it had allowed to happen in the name of moral reform. If this story disturbed you, good. History's darkest chapters demand to be remembered, not because we enjoy the horror, but because forgetting guarantees repetition. These women deserve more than our sympathy. They deserve our commitment to never allowing such systematic abuse to hide behind religious authority or social convenience again. Hit that like button if you believe truth matters more than comfort. Subscribe if you think the stories society tried to bury are exactly the ones we need to hear. And share this with someone who needs to understand what happens when we let institutions operate in shadows. The women who died in unmarked graves can't speak anymore, but we can make damn sure their story doesn't die with them.